Welcome to the Finance Garage podcast, your go-to podcast for navigating the world of finance. I'm Jonathan, your financial guide, bringing the latest market trends, investment strategies, and financial news that matters to you. And by the way, I'm also going to share my other passion, which is cars.
At the SWU Group, we help everyday families achieve financial success. Our integrated services include financial planning, accounting, credit advisory, and estate planning. We're here to guide and support you every step of the way, from custom investment strategies to maximizing tax efficiency. We ensure your financial goals are met with peace of mind. Visit simonwu.com.au for more information.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Finance Garage podcast. As always, I'm Jonathan Wu, Principal and Senior Financial Advisor here at the SWU Group. And today we're diving into ethical and ESG investing. And I'm really excited to have Paul Harding-Davis from Advice IQ here with me to unpack this tricky topic. Now, when it comes to ethical investing, one of the biggest challenges is that what feels ethical or responsible to one person might not line up with someone else's values. This can make things confusing, especially when we're talking about investments that are supposed to reflect those values. And to make it even more complicated, sometimes what an investment claims to be on the surface doesn't exactly match what's actually inside the portfolio. And really, that's a source of where a lot of the frustration and confusion comes in. In this episode, Paul and I are going to chat about these issues, why greenwashing is a concern, and how investors can better understand what they're really putting their money into. Culture also plays a large part into ethical and ESG investing, and even the realities of livelihoods plays a role in how certain people view this area. So let's get into it. Grab a drink, relax, and join us as we dig into the world of ethical and ESG investing. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Jonathan. Great to be here.
Now, we've known each other for about 20 years when I was a wee lad, slightly younger.
Something like that. I have some young photos.
Yes. Don't hold them against me. Just to kick this off, can you give us a 1 minute sort of precursor into your background and career?
Sure. I'm about 45 years in the financial services sector now, joined in 1978. So in fact, I think I may even be approaching 46. I've worked mainly in wealth management, and in the last 20 years, mainly as the head of financial advice networks and also as CEO of an investment management business. In the period 2002 to 2010, I worked in a couple of ethical investment management firms, and I spent 7 years on the board of the Responsible Investment Association of Australasia. As a general statement too, I'm also a fellow of the Institute of Company Directors.
Excellent. So that, you have quite a lot of experience in this space, and that's why I want to unpack, because honestly, it's been an area that's been confusing for us and our investment committee, and then how that then sort of connects with the values that our clients have is still somewhat, to me, a bit of a mystery, because, you've said this to me in the past, I'm a bit too young to be cynical about, so many things in the world. And, if you were to ask me what my earliest memory of ESG investing was, it was probably 15 years ago at a dealer group PD day, where BT Funds Management at the time was presenting, and they did some sort of analysis about ESG and their screening process around the big four banks, and somehow their conclusion was Westpac was the best ESG bank, right, to invest, which again, optically as a marketing or salesperson, a bit ironic that it was their parent at the time, probably not the best example. And so, that's something that stuck with me for a while, right? And that's sort of why I continue to this day to be a bit cynical about things. But if we kick things off and discuss, from your perspective, what's the difference between ethical and ESG investing? Because some people get them intertwined, and some people think it's the same thing, but it's actually not. What's your perspective and differences in your opinion?
Sure. But firstly, let me say that the Westpac story was topical for me in my time at Australian Ethical as well, and so it's an interesting story. But before that, let me emphasize for you and everybody listening that cynicism about companies, cynicism when you're investing, is always a prudent thing to have. Annual reports are very carefully written and very carefully spun documents. That would be a cynical statement by myself, but I think most of us would agree that that's true. But at the time, Westpac was an interesting example. So we're going back to around 2008-ish. At Australian Ethical, We had always had all four of the major banks excluded from the portfolios for a range of reasons, but particularly some of the corporate activities and lending to corporations that were not able to be invested in our portfolios. But once Westpac acquired St. George, its ratio of business shifted materially and it became much more a retail bank and became a sort of 65% retail lender, home mortgages. And we had the view that owning a home plays a strong role in the well-being and dignity of people, and that therefore that changed the view. And Westpac actually became the first of the big four banks to be included in the Australian ethical portfolios. At the time, they had been regarded as leaders in gender equality and some of the other factors that were also seen as positive in that space. But look, let's get back to the broader headings of ESG, environmental, social, and governance, and ethical investing. They do have an overlap, and in the early days, they were more than close. Environmental, social, and governance criteria were essentially the core tools used by ethical investors to decide what they would or wouldn't invest in. Now, ethical investing is now really regarded as avoiding, well, there's three ways you can look at it. One is, and the main way is that you'll be avoiding investing in things that contradict with your values, your preferences. So the obvious ones are gambling, alcohol, tobacco, pornography, armaments, and there are a lot of people who just don't want their money providing capital to support businesses in those sectors. You can have a positive screen where you go out and actively look to support businesses which you think are doing something that's more sustainable or long-term. Recycling is a good example. And so you want your money to be making a positive difference in the world. That's more the ethical world. And as you said earlier, and rightly, it can be a challenge because I know I've sat down with church investment funds, and we had assets in our portfolio at Australian Ethical that were just excluded by their ethical position.
Yep.
And so they couldn't invest in our fund, even though everything else in our fund aligned with that was a deal breaker for them. So it can be tricky. What I would say is, if you are looking at an ethical investment manager, what you want is to see somebody that has a really rigorous process for wrestling with these issues. You may not always agree with where they get to, but if you know that they have worked really hard to identify the issues and form a view, then that's probably the best thing to look for, because you'll get close to the outcome you want most of the time. The other option, of course, is to pick direct shares yourself or rather work with your advisor to create a portfolio of shares, and then you can remove ones or kick out ones that you just don't agree with your interests. Really, ESG investing took off in a new way when the United Nations developed its principles for responsible investment. And their aim was to take responsible investing out of that narrow ethical framework and help capital be allocated to companies that were better governed, say diversity on boards, transparency, avoiding bribery, and so on, and that were being more sustainable in the world. Those attributes are seen in the ESG world, the environmental attributes, the social attributes, the governance attributes, as identifiers of long-term better outcomes, both as an investment and in their impact on the world. So ESG investors, and that would be particularly all of the large investment industry funds, public sector funds, pension funds in the US, and most of the world's large investment managers, have signed up to the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment and committed to identifying environmental, social, and governance responsibilities. So they look for risks that come from those things and for mispricing in companies that perhaps are cheaper than they should be or more expensive than they should be if you identify some of those risks. Now, the performance numbers are interesting because you would expect, and a lot of people still expect, if you're going to exclude a portion of the equities universe, that you've narrowed your field of selection, that you would underperform. two answers, two parts of the answer to that. The first is the so-called sin stocks show that they have a higher performance usually, but they actually do so with a higher risk, with higher volatility. So in share market language, they have a higher beta.
Yep.
Now, no free lunches in this world. So yes, they outperform, but they do so with greater risk. When you risk adjust, you'll find that most ethical funds and ESG funds deliver the same or a competitive risk-adjusted return over time, but it's a different path up the mountain.
Is that different path up the mountain, in your view, and all the views that we express here are personal in nature, is that a better mountain to climb? And I don't know, I always think, is it just because it makes me feel better?
Well, that's a great question. Now, there's nothing wrong with feeling better about your assets and your money, and there's nothing wrong with choosing to align your wealth with what's important to you. There's also nothing wrong, in my view, with making sure that you are stewarding your money well in terms of I want to get a sensible or the best reasonable return I can get depending on the level of risk that I'm comfortable with. So I don't have a problem or concern with people choosing either methodology. It is not just about feeling better, though. There are aspects, for example, governance is a really interesting one. And I'm sure we'll get to governance if we talk about China and Asia later as well. The biggest pension fund in the world is in California. It's a pair of them, CalPERS and CalSTRS. Yeah, that's so STRS is, I think, the teachers one. They're enormous. They got to the stage where they realized they were actually basically holding some sort of exposure via the investment managers they had in every one of the S&P 500 companies.
Yep.
Well, why pay an active manager if on accumulated holdings you're always holding them? Better off, effectively doing your own internal index, and then they worked with those companies to try and improve governance. Now, it's been a long time since I've seen their numbers, but they had evidence that something like the first 5 or 10 years that they did that they'd added 50 basis points per annum better performance from those companies by working with them to improve their governance. It shouldn't be a shock that a well-governed, a well-run company delivers a better result, should it?
Sure. Yep.
And so there is evidence, absolutely, that focusing on governance will deliver a better investment performance.
So it leads me into this point, that we're going to discuss about Asia, right, and governance. So as you know, I've been studying and analyzing investing in Asia for over 20 years now. And one of the things I've observed is that ESG and ethical investing has largely been a Western developed economy construct because they can afford to, right? To construct the needs for it, right? And probably around 5 to 6 years ago, pre-COVID, I was sitting on a global equity fund update, and they talked about their underlying stock picks in the portfolio and what those companies' underlying carbon footprint is. And I recall that when I got back to the office, I immediately called my Hong Kong equity team and I said, hey, for our funds, right, invest in China and Asia more broadly, what's our carbon footprint? And they just looked at me and said, doesn't exist, right? Because carbon footprint, as one element of ESG, was never a requirement for Asian companies. And today, it's still not a requirement, right? So it's sort of voluntary reporting, shall we say, right? And one of the anecdotes that the Hong Kong equity team shared with me is that they found this very broad, it's a generalized observation, that there's a correlation between the number of people that a corporate can spend to write reams and reams of paper about ESG and everything great that they're doing to the world, and the less that they care, because they just need to get the eyeballs of investors that are signed up to UNPRI and so on and so forth, but not that they genuinely care. But in the opposite direction, they found a lot of companies that that don't have the capital to spend on reporting, but they genuinely do care and have a lot of initiatives to, be ESG friendly. I mean, what's your take on that from even a Western perspective?
Yeah, it's a really thorny question, I think, and I put it under the heading of form over substance.
Yep.
You can write the best environmental report in the world. That doesn't mean the substance of what you're doing is really worthy or really makes a difference. You might remember, how long ago was it now? 15 years ago, when Enron collapsed. But it had 6 or 9 months before it collapsed, it had ticked off world's best practice on governance.
There you go.
And so I'm always cynical about bureaucratic notions, bureaucratic structures and teams, and because in the end, they tend to become about the form of it and not about the substance. So you're right, there will be companies that absolutely care, but they aren't reporting in China and Asia, because this is still early development in both as companies, but also as the stock exchange and the regulatory world that they live in. And it will grow and it will become a requirement, almost certainly, because it is so in most of the rest of the world. And the challenge always is for the regulators to try and make it of substance, not just as they require these things, to make it not just a ticker box exercise. So I would again emphasize that the challenge here for investors and for advisors like you and your clients is, as we talked about earlier, identify the substance, don't get taken in by the form. I think I said earlier that annual reports are carefully written and carefully spun, and so are some sustainability reports for companies. And indeed, so are some investment statements, and we plan to talk a little bit later about greenwashing and ASIC's sort of crackdown on that. But it's good to be cynical sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's sometimes dangerous to be cynical, too cynical, and I want to avoid that because, most people want to do good in the world, and I sort of liken to analogy at our most recent, which we're going to have a federal election next year, but at the most recent federal election when Albanese was elected, I remember that it was the wave of teal that was elected.
Yes, yeah.
And the wave of teal basically meant a lot of people were voting, not necessarily greeny per se, but it's just, alternative views. And I remember a financial advisor posted up on LinkedIn quite shortly thereafter in Melbourne, where there was a number of teal seats being taken out as well. And he said, so in my household, I've got 3 kids, and all 3 kids voted teal, right? And I voted non-teal. And my kids voted for teal because they're, anti-pollution and, they want carbon to be clean and, all those things. And he said, those are great values to live by. So as a household, because they are such supportive of these sort of measures, I have made an active decision to the following. Number 1, because we want to care for the environment, that hot showers will no longer be more than 2 minutes a day per person. We are going to sell all our cars, and we will only catch public transport from now on, and that public transport must be run on renewable energy, so it'd be gas or solar, whatever it may be, hydrogen. To save energy, because we don't want to burn so much coal, Wi-Fi will be turned off in the household from 8 p.m. at night, and there was one more that I can't remember. But I thought that was a really great way of encapsulating. I think everyone wants to be good, but if you were then asked to make the sacrifice, it could be a very different, it could be a different situation altogether. And I think you shared with me recently, we were talking about preparing for this podcast, about the Vietnamese farmer, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. And do you want to sort of quickly share
Sure.
that as anecdote?
Well, I think I'll share 2 that are kind of cousins of that anecdote that you just shared. And the first is, if I'm a fisherman or a farmer in Vietnam, and My main mission is to actually get enough food for my kids so that they can grow up healthy and have an opportunity in life. And if that means I'm going to overfish, I'm going to overfish. And I'm not going to be too fussed about the environmental impact of that. Similarly, if I'm one of the few 100 million people in China, India, and Africa who still don't have electricity, and you can push a button and say, if we build coal, you can have electricity, but you won't get there with solar or wind for, in some of those areas you might not get there with wind ever, but then I'm going to push the button and take coal, because then I have a chance of good health, I have a chance of education for my children, and I have a chance of business opportunities and better nutrition. So most people in the world, they want to do good, but they want to feed their family.
Correct.
And that is a higher order priority for almost everybody. So it's a thorny balance that we try and achieve, but it is the reality that there are poor people, desperately poor people. They are not in a position or do not have the luxury of saying, well, I might turn the Wi-Fi off. They haven't got to Wi-Fi yet. They don't have to turn the power off because they haven't got there yet. In fact, interestingly, there's some clever photos of North Korea and South Korea 70 years ago and today, and of course North Korea still mostly has no lights at night because it's a communist country and it's simply been unable to, like most communist countries, unable to provide for its people. So I think we have to be careful that we don't actually cause harm to the people who are most vulnerable in how we go about these things.
Yep. I want to share an investment sort of concept, which may surprise people, right? So, as we know, I think I saw a statistic, last week, that if we do a Google search on something, and then we do an input or a prompt, as they call it, into a ChatGPT, it requires about 18 times more energy to complete a ChatGPT prompt routine than it is to complete a Google search. Right. So Google has announced, I think about 2 weeks ago, they're going to reignite some of the nuclear power generators in the US to keep up with the demand for their version of ChatGPT called Gemini. Now, that requires overall just a massive upgrade of the grid as conceptually, right, across Western and emerging markets. Now, China is the world's largest deployer in the most recent 3 or 4 years in renewable energy, right, which is mainly wind and solar, mainly predominantly sitting in the Gobi Desert area because that's where the efficacy and the largest intake is. But the biggest challenge is then if you've extracted it from the Gobi Desert, how do you bring it to the coast, which is where the most of the population is? That then requires a huge investment into ultra high voltage lines, transmission lines. And China's doing that at a rate of knots, right? If you compare, and I've seen these maps of the China ultra high voltage lines versus say the US, it's starkly different, okay? Where most of the green energy belt in the US goes down the middle of it. So you're talking about Texas, I think Wisconsin, like that part of the middle belt of the US. But it's very hard to get the energy across because you've got to go over state lines.
Yep.
Now people then said, when I shared that story, they go, well, Jonathan, that's because, China's just being more green. And the actual reality, it's not. It's actually half the price for China to deploy solar and wind than it is for coal. It's actually their cost to produce. It is a pure cost and not a greeny issue per se. The US, on the other hand, is trying to get to there, but because of the politics, it's very hard to deploy the ultra high voltage lines, because if it's going to go across state borders, who's going to pay for that, right? And so,
and the state laws are different.
And the state laws are different. So, there are also the inverse situations where there are emerging economies, right, like China, that is doing this solely because of costs and not because of an ESG issue. It's just better for them. So I think people also need to keep in mind that as such.
Ready to take the first step in investing, or just looking to continue growing your wealth without being inundated with financial information? With SWU Online Invest, we offer a range of expertly managed portfolios designed to match your investment needs. Whether you're a seasoned investor or just getting started, know that we will work tirelessly to ensure your investments are strategically positioned to maximize your goals. Visit swuonlineinvest.com.au today.
So Paul, if we bring this conversation now back locally, recently ABC News did an investigation into industry super funds. This is around July of 24. And they found that some were invested in controversial weapons and, specifically nuclear-related weaponry. You can find this video on YouTube and just, Google what I just said.
Yep.
But what they found was ART, which is the Australian Retirement Trust, which I think is the combination of Sun Super and Q Super from a few years ago,
yes.
is that their socially conscious fund says it doesn't invest in companies that makes weapons using depleted uranium. There's a weapon called the PGU-14B, which is a 30 millimeter armory shell that's used mainly to rip through tanks. And the shell is very effective because it's got depleted uranium in it, which makes it pierce through armor really easily, but you can poison people and they'll die from nuclear poisoning. Now, ART have said they didn't buy the shares, but it was given them as security for a loan, and now they've closed this arrangement off completely. So that's one example. Then we've got the largest super fund in Australia, which is Australian Super, and in their socially aware option, it says it won't invest in controversial weapons, but it only takes out cluster munitions and landmines. But it's actually got millions of dollars invested in companies that make nuclear weapons, including Northrop Grumman, which is an example of a US company that is upgrading the US Air Force's nuclear arsenal, right? And the explanation that they have is that we've invested in this company because it's in the best financial interest of members, okay? So this is their socially aware option. Then furthermore, Rest, Mercer, and Spirit Super all invest in controversial weapons as defined by Morningstar in their in their definition of controversial weapons in July of this year as well. So there's an argument to be said, and I recently saw a piece literally in the last couple of days, that there's all these new defense ETFs that's being launched, right? And those companies are absolutely, making truckloads because of escalating conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine. So the demand for these things are there. I mean, is there potentially some marketing issue around if we're investing a socially conscious or socially aware option? Is there certain expectations by the public of what says on the tin and what they're actually invested in?
Well, I think the most important thing is transparency, and the Vanguard recently criticized by and ultimately fined by ASIC for greenwashing. Now, they actually self-reported that they discovered that there was, and that they'd used an external ratings or research house, but what it meant was that what they'd said they were doing wasn't accurate, but like I say, in their defense, they self-reported, and it was based on information that they had obtained from an external research house. And when they found out, but they have been substantially criticized by ASIC. ASIC has a strong focus on identifying managers and superannuation funds that are claiming to do green or sustainable, responsible investing, but are not. What I would say is, and you and I both know after substantial time in the industry now, when you're dealing with enormous global companies, it's hard to completely rule out that they have a holding in or an ownership of a smaller company or a smaller business unit that might have some connection to armaments. I mean, you'd think the CEO would know every detail, although no, it's just not possible. There's could be 50, 60, 70,000 employees in countries all around the world, and they may well be involved in something. I think that, as I understand it, one of those very large funds here has basically had to accept that with the size and breadth of its holdings, it can't ever unequivocally make a statement that it has no exposure, because they could invest in a company that's somewhere down in the business, or after they've invested in it, it starts to do that. And annual reports come out. There's a lot of looking backwards in the company information when it comes out. So I think in terms of, clearly you would expect that there's going to be sustained demand for armaments in the world. There's no sign of reduction. On the contrary, there's signs of potential increase in threatening macro events. You mentioned a couple, but I'd mention countries that are dangerous like North Korea, and we have a very interesting scenario where they're now supplying troops, because what do North Korea have? Manpower. What do they don't have? Technology. What does Russia have? Technology. What are they struggling to find? Manpower.
Yep.
They're next door to each other almost.
Match made in heaven.
Match made in heaven. So you and I both know that China is spending an enormous amount of money building up its defense forces. We know the United States, even though it's slowed down, is still spending an enormous amount of money building up its defense forces. I don't mean to be cynical, but I personally hold out very little expectation that ESG investing will have material influence in this area, because the drivers are outside capital, or perhaps more accurately, the providers of the capital and the primary customers are in fact the governments.
Correct.
So armaments is one area where I have little expectation that ESG or ethical investing will do anything more than the individual investor can say, I didn't support it. And that's fine for those that matters to, that would be important to. And those vehicles are available, and firms like yours have no problem getting access to them. They're on all the major investment platforms, and you can easily incorporate them in anybody's portfolio or exclude some of them from people's portfolio.
So interesting you talk about, client portfolios. If we sort of bring it to that level now, is that we look after about 500 clients here in the group, and out of all of those, and some of these clients we've looked after for 30 years, from memory, Simon has had one client that has asked to be invested in ethical global shares,
Yep.
which we ended up going down in an index option for them. And then I had one client who started their journey with me probably 6 years ago, and she's Buddhist.
Yep.
And she specifically asked me, Jonathan, I don't want to invest in casinos, which is fine. And I said, that's fine, but I just want you to let you know that I will, as best as I can, avoid to hold gambling companies. But I can never guarantee, because we're investing in funds, and those funds may choose, right?
Sure.
They're not specifically ethical funds as such, and the only way, not necessarily give you an ironclad guarantee, as we've discussed already, but as close to a guarantee as possible that it won't hold it, is to buy an ethical fund. And she said, oh, no, I don't want an ethical fund. It may not generate the returns that I want. Yeah. And I said, that's interesting. And I said, but again, going back to this point, some of these active Aussie share funds may hold Crown at the time, or may hold Star Entertainment, or Tabcorp,
Yep.
right? That's nothing, I can't avoid it. And she goes, and this is the thing that sort of blew me away. She said, as long as I don't know about it, it's fine.
Well, I'll give you an interesting challenge is Woolworths. A significant portion of Woolworths' profit is generated by pubs, and those pubs all have pokies. Woolworths are a very large gambling company in this country, but most people aren't aware of that. And even when they are aware of it, there are other good reasons for holding Woolworths. It's a defensive.
It's
it does
a
well.
duopoly almost.
It does well. It's a duopoly almost. It does well and protects your portfolio when in a time of recession or poor economic. But it's a classic example of a very, very large company that has a division that does alcohol, alcohol and gambling. And so it's not always easy. And I go back to my point, when you take an ethical manager or when you're looking at these things, the important thing is to identify what you can, wrestle with what you can, and then know that you've made a sensible effort to reflect the values that are important to you in that portfolio. Interestingly, there was some research done by, the acronym is LOHAS, L-O-H-A-S. I can no longer remember what that long an acronym stands for. But it's all about lifestyle. And one of the last things that people fully align with their values is, in fact, money. But it's about 3% of the population that the research shows are serious about aligning their money with their values.
Lifestyle of health and sustainability.
There you go.
LOHAS.
Yeah. So, for example, people going down that journey will get into preventive health and as simple as massages or other nutrition and the like. And then they'll be looking for organic and for locally produced goods and work their way up. But money is one of the last things on the spectrum that gets aligned. And the numbers last time I looked were about 3% of the population. And when I was at Australian Ethical, that was pretty consistent with and on the board of the Responsible Investment Association, it was about 3% of if you exclude the broader ESG investors, if you just purely looked at ethical, it was about 3% of retail investors.
Interesting. Now, to round things off, something that I forgot to ask you at the beginning was, we call this podcast the Finance Garage for a reason.
Right.
And what do you drive? And what's your interest in cars, if any?
Well, I'm married, so we have an averaged out interest in cars. I have a much greater interest than my wife Annette, who has no interest. We, at the moment, have two cars. One is a Lexus SUV, one of the smaller SUVs, and the other is a SsangYong Rexton, which I bought because we had a Caravan until it got written off by hail damage. But it was a Korean car, beautifully made, really best value car I've ever owned. And we may get a Caravan again. And while we are still
Young?
we're still in our go years, we need to make that decision in the next year or so, and until I do, those are the two cars we'll have. If we don't get a Caravan, then we'll downsize the SsangYong to a small, economical. We have friends who have a tiny little BMW electric one, which narrow range, but for running around the local area is a fabulous solution. So we'll investigate that. But in the meantime, it's all dependent on a Caravan decision, which is not where you expected the car question to go, is it?
No, but I can loop it back to cars in saying that the biggest consideration for you, assuming that you buy a Caravan, is that you need to have a car or a vehicle that can tow.
Correct.
Right? And tow a specific type.
Up to 3.5 ton, dual axle. So we'll probably buy one that that tows at 3 to 3.5 ton, 3 to 3.3 ton sort of thing, because it has to have a bathroom, it has to have a shower, and it has to have a washing machine. And
so it's very unlikely, you were telling me before, that the next lower limit of towing capacity is what, 2.7?
2.7.
Yeah, and if you want something with a bathroom or something, there's no way.
It's possible.
How small is that going to
be? Smaller than we want.
As in you're going to live in the bathroom?
Oh, no. Well, look, there are clever designs out there. Some of those ones can have a pop top but still have a bathroom. They probably wouldn't have a washing machine. And for Annette, that's a must. And well, that works for the both of us. And as you've alluded to my age, I don't make it all the way through the night these days, so proximity of a bathroom is important.
Now, on that note, Paul, thank you very much for joining me today on the Finance Garage, talking about ESG and ethical investing. I mean, we had no intention of solving the world's issues in today, but it was more about highlighting this area because, some people say that it's a bee in my bonnet, and I think it will forever be challenging. Given the diversity of views in this area. But as investors, you should think about, what values you want reflected in the way that you invest, as Paul alluded to. I think that is critical, as opposed to just sort of throwing caution to the wind and just buying any socially conscious or ethical fund that you see named, because you should look under the bonnet a bit more, or speak to your financial advisor to look under the bonnet.
Just before we finish, I probably overlooked one really important point on the governance side, which is particularly relevant to some of the attractive themes that you and I see in the world. As long as I've been investing in China and Asia-based investments for 14 or 15 years now, and I read the book of the founder of Value Partners, one of the managers in Hong Kong, and G, governance, it may not be as reported by companies, but it's always been a central investment research and investment selection tool. In some respects, the governance question is almost more important in China and Asia than it is in the West, because you are really reliant on the particular people who are the chair and the CEO of the company and the directors. And so I would argue that in China and in Asia, governance has always been a tool of investing.
Yep, fantastic. So remember, everybody, that remember to listen to the end with the disclaimer that none of what we've said today is obviously personal advice. We're happy to take on any feedback, and you can contact me directly at jonathan.wu@simonwu.com.au. But Paul, thanks very much for your time today.
Pleasure. Good conversation. Thanks.
This podcast is not financial product advice and is intended to provide information only. It does not take into account the investment objectives, financial situation, or needs of any person. You should assess whether the information is appropriate for you and consider talking to a financial advisor before making any investment decisions. Any investment examples are for illustrative purposes only. The information is taken from sources which are believed to be accurate, but Simon Wu, Jonathan Wu, SWU Financial Planning, and Personal Financial Services Limited accept no liability of any kind to any person who relies on the information contained in the podcast. Unless expressly stated, none of the information should be taken as a recommendation. For more information, please visit www.simonwu.com.au.